It was 4:17 a.m., December 21st, 1944. The Ardennes forest was burning. Snowflakes melted on blood-soaked mud as Private First Class Daniel Mercer dragged himself through the wreckage of what had been his platoon's outpost. A German shell had torn his leg open from thigh to knee. His radio was gone. His unit, E Company, 328th Infantry, was trapped 3 miles behind enemy lines, surrounded and cut off from all reinforcements. Mercer's pulse slowed as he pressed a trembling hand to his wound. He could hear German voices closing in, boots crunching on frost. Then he stopped breathing, closed his eyes, let his head fall into the snow. When the enemy patrol found his body minutes later, they marked him as dead. What they didn't know was that Daniel Mercer's death had just begun the most improbable rescue of the Battle of the Bulge. Daniel Mercer wasn't a hero, at least not the kind the Army put on posters. He was a 26-year-old radio operator from Topeka, Kansas. Quiet, unremarkable, the kind of soldier who followed orders and fixed things no one noticed were broken. Before the war, he'd been a telegraph repairman. He liked machines because they didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't bleed. In 1943, when his draft notice came, he told his mother he'd just be running wires. But the Army had other plans. By late 1944, he was embedded with the 101st Airborne's 328th Infantry Regiment, somewhere in the dense woods of eastern Belgium. The Ardennes was supposed to be quiet, a rest sector. Soldiers called it the Ghost Front because nothing happened there until it did. On December 16, 1944, Hitler launched a massive counteroffensive through the region, shattering the calm. Tens of thousands of German troops surged through the snow, smashing thin American lines. Entire units vanished overnight. Mercer's unit had been ordered to establish a forward listening post near the small village of Hosingen, deep in the forest. Their mission was simple: monitor enemy movement and relay coordinates back to headquarters. But when the offensive hit, their lines of communication were severed. Wires cut, radios jammed, snow clogging every transmission. Within hours, they were isolated. By nightfall, German armor had rolled between them and the main Allied force. For 4 days, they held their ground, freezing, out of food, nearly out of ammunition. The enemy shelled them without mercy. The forest itself seemed to scream with every blast. On the morning of December 21st, a direct hit collapsed their dugout. Half the men died instantly. The survivors scattered, crawling for cover, clutching rifles that no longer worked. When Mercer woke up beneath splintered logs, his radio was destroyed, his leg torn open, and his commanding officer was dead. There were perhaps 30 men left alive, from an original company of over 100. Worse, he could hear German voices sweeping the woods, checking for survivors. That was the moment he made a decision that no one could have predicted. One that would turn a wounded radio man into the ghost who fooled an entire German division. Mercer lay beneath the wreckage for almost an hour, drifting in and out of consciousness. Every time he moved, the pain in his leg sent a blinding flash through his vision. Snow hissed as it touched the torn flesh. Around him, the world was silent except for the crackle of distant gunfire and the muffled voices of German soldiers combing through the trees. They were methodical, checking bodies, stripping weapons, kicking boots to see who twitched. Mercer heard one soldier laughing as he pried a ring off a dead man's hand. He held his breath and pressed his face into the dirt, blood freezing on his cheek. When a pair of boots stopped beside him, his pulse nearly stopped. The soldier leaned down, muttered something about Ein toter Funker, a dead radio man, and moved on. Mercer waited until the footsteps faded. Then he exhaled slowly, realizing that death, or at least the illusion of it, had just saved his life. But his unit wasn't so lucky. Through the haze, Mercer could still hear fragments of radio chatter before the static died. Desperate calls from neighboring platoons reporting encirclement. The 328th Infantry was being swallowed whole. The nearest friendly line was more than 4 miles west, beyond frozen ridges crawling with German patrols. Command had no idea E Company was still alive, and without communication, no one was coming. Mercer was the last radio man. His SCR-300 set was shattered, antenna bent, tubes cracked. But scattered near the bodies of his crew, he found fragments of 2 more units, damaged but not destroyed. The thought of repairing them in sub-zero temperatures, under fire, was insane. Yet if he didn't, the survivors, about 30 men still hiding in the woods, would be left for dead. By dusk, the temperature had dropped below -10 degrees Celsius. The snow reflected an eerie orange glow from distant fires. Somewhere in the chaos, a captain named Lewis had gathered what remained of the company in an abandoned farmhouse. Mercer crawled there under cover of darkness, dragging his ruined leg through the snow. When he reached them, the men barely recognized him, his face ghostly pale, uniform stiff with blood. Lewis knelt beside him, whispered, "We thought you were gone." Mercer coughed, forcing a weak smile. Guess they did too. But behind that faint grin was calculation. The Germans already believed he was dead. That meant he could move in ways no living soldier could. If he could use that illusion, if he could make them believe he wasn't there, he might just find a way to call for help. Still, the obstacles were brutal. The Germans had captured all the known Allied frequencies. The only working transmitter nearby was a field set on a wrecked half-track in the valley below, inside enemy lines. To get there meant crawling straight into German territory with a shattered leg, no backup, and no guarantee of ever coming back. The men thought he was delirious when he said he'd go. But Mercer wasn't acting out of bravery. He was acting out of math. If he could fix that transmitter, if he could send even one burst signal westward before the battery died, he could pinpoint their location for artillery or paratrooper support. He had one chance, one broken leg, and one thing working in his favor. Every German in that valley thought he was already dead. Night fell like a curtain over the Ardennes. The forest that had once hidden the 328th now turned against them, each branch snapping under snow like a gunshot. Inside the ruined farmhouse, the men whispered around a dying lantern. Mercer lay propped against the wall, his face gray, his bandaged leg oozing through torn cloth. Captain Lewis tried to reason with him one last time. "Dan, you can't even walk," he said quietly. "You go out there. You won't make it 10 yards. Mercer stared at the frozen floorboards. "They think I'm dead," he murmured. "Might as well use it." No one replied. The logic was insane, but unshakable. If the Germans believed Mercer had already been killed and tagged among the corpses near the ridge, his face meant nothing to them. In war, recognition was survival, and anonymity, for once, could be weaponized. At 0200 hours, Mercer began preparing. He tore a blood-soaked sleeve from his jacket and wrapped it around his face. He removed his dog tags and replaced them with a German medic's patch, taken from a fallen soldier. Then he did something no one in the room would forget. He covered himself in frost, dust, and mud, until he looked less like a man than a ghost risen from snow. He carried no weapon, only a broken radio handset, wire cutters, and a single battery pack in a satchel. Before he left, Captain Lewis pressed a hand on his shoulder. "If you make it, send the call sign Iron Tree. HQ will know." Mercer nodded. And if I don't? Lewis gave a faint smile. Then we freeze together. Crawling through the forest took hours. Each movement was agony. His leg dragged uselessly behind him, leaving a dark smear across white snow. Twice, German patrols passed within feet. Once, he froze entirely as a flare burst overhead, illuminating the skeletal trees and the frozen bodies of American soldiers half buried beneath drifts. When the light faded, he resumed crawling. By dawn, he reached the wreckage of the half-track, a twisted metal shell half covered in snow. 2 German corpses still slumped beside it. Inside, the field transmitter sat wedged between the seats, riddled with shrapnel but intact enough to repair. He pried it open with a knife, whispering to himself through gritted teeth. The cold made his fingers useless, but his telegraph training kicked in. He stripped wires with his teeth, resoldered contacts using the faint heat from a flare stub, and scavenged a new antenna from a broken rifle barrel. His breaths came shallow, visible as fog in the dawn air. When he finally powered the set, a faint hum filled the half-track, a sound so small, so fragile, it made his heart race. But there was a problem. The transmitter couldn't broadcast on Allied frequencies. It was tuned to a captured German band. Switching frequencies would take hours, time he didn't have. That's when Mercer's fake death turned into something more. He decided to pretend to be German. Using the weak signal, he sent short bursts in broken Morse code under a German call sign, posing as a forward scout reporting enemy survivors in the forest. Each burst carried coordinates, his coordinates, encoded in a way only American interceptors would decode correctly. He signed off with a chilling message. Feindgruppe 800 Männer, eingeschlossen, preparing strike. Enemy group, 800 men, surrounded, preparing strike. He knew Allied intelligence would hear it, know it was wrong and triangulate. But the Germans, thinking it was one of their own, would ignore it completely. Then, as the sun rose, Mercer slumped against the cold steel and whispered, "Come, find us." He closed his eyes, exhausted, unaware that he had just sent a message that would set in motion one of the most precise rescue operations of the entire Battle of the Bulge. The message traveled faster than bullets. Within minutes, it was bouncing across static-filled airwaves, intercepted by both sides but understood by only one. At a listening station outside Bastogne, a young American cryptographer named Harold Luntz frowned at his receiver. The German call sign didn't match any known unit, but the embedded coordinates aligned exactly with the last known position of E Company. The message claimed 800 enemy soldiers preparing strike. But that didn't add up. It was almost as if the sender wanted to be found. Luntz walked the paper to his commanding officer, Colonel William Harper, who glanced at it once and muttered, "Get me artillery command." By 7:30 a.m., 12 M101 howitzers of the 333 Field Artillery Battalion were pivoted toward the forest east of Hosingen. The fire mission was marked Urgent Counter-Battery. They didn't know who had sent the coordinates, only that it came from inside the enemy perimeter. Meanwhile, back in the frozen valley, Mercer was slipping in and out of consciousness. The transmitter was still faintly humming beside him, its battery nearly dead. Through half-closed eyes, he saw movement in the tree line. German engineers, 6 of them, approaching the half-track. He froze. One of them pointed. "Amerikaner!" the soldier shouted. Mercer's heart stopped. Then another soldier laughed. "Nein, der ist tot. Look at him." They climbed onto the half-track, dragging the dead body out by the arm. Mercer let his head loll back, eyes unfocused. One soldier even poked his side with a rifle. Satisfied, they dumped him into a ditch beside other corpses and started salvaging equipment. Then the first artillery shell hit. The explosion tore through the valley, scattering men like leaves. The engineers dove for cover as the second and third shells slammed into the tree line. Smoke, snow, and debris filled the air. Mercer rolled into the ditch, covering his head as shrapnel screamed overhead. Somewhere above him, a German officer was shouting orders, cut off mid-sentence by the fourth shell. For 5 eternal minutes, the ground shook under relentless fire. The shells weren't random. They were walking precisely west to east, zeroing in on the valley floor. Mercer realized what that meant. The coordinates had been received. His fake transmission had worked. The Allies were firing directly at his signal, and soon they'd move in. He grabbed the transmitter and, with trembling fingers, tapped a final burst. Friendly. Hold fire. Iron tree. Hold. Then the battery died. Up in the farmhouse, Captain Lewis and the surviving 30 men heard the barrage echo through the forest. One of the sergeants whispered, "That's our grid." They waited. 2 minutes, 5, 10, until the shelling stopped. Then came the distant rumble of engines. American Shermans from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion rolled through the tree line, guns still smoking. Behind them, infantry from the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment advanced cautiously, scanning for survivors. The farmhouse door burst open as Lewis stumbled out waving a white cloth. "Friendly! Friendly fire! Hold fire!" he yelled. The lead sergeant froze. Jesus Christ, they're alive. By 9:10 a.m., the valley was secure. 800 men, survivors from E and F companies and 2 lost recon units, were pulled from the snow, starving, frost-bitten, but alive. Nearly all owed their lives to a dead man who wasn't dead. When the medics found Mercer hours later, he was unconscious, barely breathing, his pulse faint. They thought he'd never make it. One medic wrote KIA, probable hypothermia, on his tag, before another noticed the faint movement of his chest. "He's alive," the medic whispered. "How the hell is he alive?" They loaded him onto a jeep bound for Bastogne. Behind them, the forest still smoldered. The rescue operation would go down in division history as one of the most successful recoveries of the campaign. But the name behind it, the soldier who tricked the enemy and called down artillery with a dead man's hand, wasn't in the report. His radio log was blank, his name listed as missing, presumed killed in action. For everyone else, Daniel Mercer had died in that valley. And that's exactly how he wanted it. For now. For 3 days, Daniel Mercer floated in and out of fevered delirium in a field hospital outside Bastogne. The medics called him the Ghost Corporal. His dog tags had been removed before the rescue, his body covered in mud and frostbite scars, his leg blackened with infection. When he finally woke up, the nurse on duty nearly dropped her clipboard. "You're supposed to be dead," she whispered. Mercer blinked, lips cracked, voice little more than a rasp. "Not yet." Word of the mysterious dead radio operator spread faster than the front line itself. Soldiers told the story around campfires and mess halls. A wounded man crawling through enemy lines, pretending to be a corpse, sending a coded message that saved hundreds. No one knew his name. Some said he was from the 82nd. Others swore he was British. The truth stayed buried in the snow, classified in the chaos of the Bulge. But his idea didn't die. 2 days after the rescue, Lieutenant Colonel Harper from Field Intelligence reviewed the intercepted Morse logs. The strange German-coded message had caught their attention again. The structure wasn't German military standard. The syntax matched American telegraph style. Someone had masked an Allied coordinate request inside enemy chatter. Harper called it one of the most ingenious field transmissions of the war. By early January 1945, Harper's analysis circulated through Allied Signal Corps channels. Commanders realized they could use the same deception to send covert messages through jammed zones. Within weeks, ghost signals, fake German broadcasts carrying hidden coordinates, were being deployed across the Western Front. The tactic was unofficial, risky, and often misunderstood, but it worked. German intercept teams dismissed the coded transmissions as their own side's misfires, never realizing they were helping Allied artillery find targets. The first confirmed success came near the village of Foy, where an American recon unit trapped by enemy tanks used the ghost signal method to call fire support. It saved 112 men. Another came near Houffalize, when paratroopers trapped in fog transmitted decoy Morse bursts on Luftwaffe frequencies. Artillery triangulated within minutes. In the after-action reports, the method was labeled Phantom Frequency Operation. The Army credited it to field innovation, origin unknown. But among those who'd been there in Hosingen, the survivors of E Company, there was no mystery. They knew whose mind had birthed it. Captain Lewis, still limping from shrapnel wounds, wrote a letter to Divisional Command. The success of the counterfire on December 21st was not coincidence. It was the deliberate act of a wounded radio operator who used deception to save his unit. His name is Private First Class Daniel Mercer, serial number 3812047. No reply ever came. The letter vanished into bureaucracy. Still, the tactic kept spreading. Signal Corps instructors began teaching signal camouflage drills to field units in France. Engineers at SHAEF headquarters quietly studied captured German frequency lists and built portable transmitters that could blend with them. Every major Allied advance from February to May 1945 used at least one ghost transmission for coordination. Meanwhile, in the field hospital, Mercer struggled to recover. Infection took his leg below the knee. He learned to walk again on a crude wooden prosthetic built by a Belgian carpenter. When he was finally discharged from the ward in March, he asked to return to his unit. The attending officer refused. "Son," he said, "you've already done your part." But the men of E Company didn't forget. They started carving small marks, a single crossed wire, on their helmets, symbolizing the message that saved them. Some carried it through Germany, others home to America. It became their silent emblem of survival, two lines crossing in the snow. By the time the war ended, hundreds of Allied soldiers had been saved by the tactic born from one man's impossible idea, a fake death that turned into a blueprint for survival. And Daniel Mercer, somewhere in a convalescent ward in France, still believed he'd failed. He didn't know yet that his lie had become legend. When the war ended in May 1945, Europe exhaled, but for Daniel Mercer, peace felt eerily hollow. He returned home to Kansas on crutches, his left pant leg pinned neatly at the knee, a small box of medals in his duffel that meant less to him than the photographs folded inside. A snowy forest, a farmhouse, and the faces of men who had lived because he hadn't. The Army officially listed him as wounded in action, presumed deceased. It took 4 months and 3 separate clerical reviews before his status was corrected to survived, invalided home. No citation, no commendation. The rescue of 800 men had been filed under unverified source intelligence. For years, Mercer tried to forget. He opened a small repair shop in Topeka, fixing radios and telephones, the quiet buzz of circuitry his only company. When customers asked about the limp, he said it was a work accident. When veterans groups held reunions, he stayed home. He didn't want to tell a story no one believed. In 1952, a letter arrived from France. It was from Captain Lewis, now Major Lewis, written in slanted ink that trembled slightly with age. They gave me a desk in D.C., Dan, but every year, on December 21st, I remember that signal, that sound that cut through the noise. The men still talk about it. They started calling it the ghost transmission. Thought you should know Mercer read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it inside his tool chest. He never replied, but the story refused to die. Historians of the Battle of the Bulge began piecing together fragments from declassified Signal Corps records in the 1970s. One report from Bastogne referenced an unidentified operator transmitting through German frequencies to deliver friendly coordinates. Another noted a single casualty later revived after being declared dead, possibly connected. In 1984, an Army archivist finally matched the serial number on Captain Lewis's forgotten letter to Mercer's service file. The story surfaced in a small military history journal titled Deceptions and Field Innovations, 1944 to 45. The article called Mercer's act one of the most daring examples of tactical improvisation ever recorded. When the piece reached him, sent by a former comrade who'd recognized the name, Mercer was 66 years old, half-deaf, still working in his shop. He sat alone that night with the magazine open under a dim lamp. His name, printed in bold, didn't look real. A week later, a local reporter came to interview him. Mercer smiled politely, answered a few questions, then shook his head when asked about heroism. "I wasn't brave," he said. "I was scared." I just did the math. He passed away 3 years later, in 1987. The Army never issued an official commendation, but the veterans of E Company pooled their savings and installed a small brass plaque in the Hosingen Woods. It reads, "In memory of Daniel Mercer, who died, so that we could live." Twice, history remembers generals, not ghosts. Yet sometimes it's the silent, invisible acts. A bent piece of wire, a fake radio code, a man pretending to be dead, that change the course of everything. Daniel Mercer's story isn't carved into monuments or textbooks, but in the frost-bitten hearts of the men who made it home because of him. He never wanted recognition. He only wanted the signal to reach someone, anyone who could help. It did. In war, innovation doesn't always come from laboratories or command tents. Sometimes it's born in a ditch, from a man bleeding into snow, using what little he has left: courage, logic, and a refusal to give up. Daniel Mercer's fake death wasn't a trick. It was a lesson that survival itself can be an act of genius. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves forgotten history. Every small act of courage, every quiet innovation, deserves to be remembered. Because behind every victory, there's someone like Daniel Mercer, still waiting to be found in the static.